The silence in the house wasn't new anymore, but it still caught me off guard sometimes. I'd be sitting in my leather recliner, the one Caroline always said made me look like an old man before my time, and I'd hear her laugh echoing from the kitchen. Then I'd remember, she's been gone 3 years now. 3 years since the cancer took her. 3 years since I've had someone to share the sunrise over Lake Minnetonka with. 3 years since anyone cared whether I remembered to take my blood pressure medication. Well, almost anyone. David calls. Every Sunday at precisely 2 o'clock, like clockwork. "How are you holding up, Dad?" he always starts, and I can hear the impatience creeping in before I even answer. He's got that tone, the one Caroline used to warn me about when David was still in high school. "He's calculating something, Robert," she'd whisper after David left the dinner table early, claiming homework. "That boy's always calculating." I should have listened to her then. Should have paid attention to the way David's eyes would light up, not when I taught him to cast a fishing line or change engine oil, but when I mentioned the lake house property values or showed him the garage full of vintage tools that had belonged to my father and his father before him. The garage. God, how I love that garage. It sits about 50 yards from the main house, down a gravel path that Caroline and I had walked together every evening for 32 years of marriage. She'd bring me a beer, I'd show her whatever project I was tinkering with, usually some old car that I had picked up for cheap and was slowly bringing back to life. A 67 Mustang, a 73 Camaro, a 55 Chevy pickup that I'd driven on our first date. "You collect cars like other people collect coins," she used to tease me, but she'd run her hand along the hood of whatever I was working on with genuine appreciation. "Each one tells a story. Every car in that garage told our story. The Mustang was the one I'd bought right after David was born, thinking maybe when he got older, we'd restore it together. Father and son, working side by side, grease under our fingernails and classic rock on the radio. The Camaro was Caroline's favorite. She said it reminded her of the car her high school boyfriend drove, which always made me pretend to be jealous until she'd kiss me quiet. The pickup truck, though, that was special. I'd taught David to drive stick shift in that truck when he was 14. We'd spend hours in the empty parking lot behind Kowalski's grocery store, David grinding gears and cursing while I tried not to laugh. When he finally got it right, smooth clutch release, perfect shift into second gear, his face lit up like Christmas morning. "Did you see that, Dad? Did you see? I got it." I remember thinking then that maybe Caroline was wrong about David. Maybe he wasn't always calculating. Maybe he was just careful, methodical like his old man. Maybe the way he approached everything like a business transaction was just his way of making sure he didn't get hurt. I held on to that hope for years. The lake house itself sits on 2 acres of prime shoreline, inherited from my grandfather, who bought it in 1952 when land up here was still cheap, and most people thought living on a lake was more trouble than it was worth. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, wrap-around porch with a view that real estate agents now describe as stunning water views and price accordingly. Caroline and I raised David here. Summers swimming off the dock, winters ice fishing and skating. David learned to water ski when he was 8, learned to drive the boat when he was 12. I taught him to bait a hook, to read the weather, to respect the water. For years he seemed to love it as much as we did. But somewhere along the way, that changed. I can pinpoint when, actually. It was David's junior year of college, business major at the University of Minnesota. He came home for Thanksgiving, and instead of asking about the ice fishing season or whether I'd winterized the boat properly, he started asking questions about property taxes, square footage, comparable sales in the neighborhood. "Dad, do you realize what this place is worth now?" I should have seen it then. The way his eyes assessed everything like line items on a balance sheet. The way he walked through the house, Caroline and I had filled with memories and saw only dollar signs. "It's worth everything," I told him. "It's home." He laughed. Not mean exactly, but dismissive. The way you'd laugh at someone who insisted on paying full price when everyone knows you're supposed to negotiate. "I'm just saying, Dad, you're sitting on a gold mine here, and with property taxes going up every year, utilities, maintenance costs, maybe it's time to consider your options." Caroline was in the kitchen making her famous apple stuffing, the recipe her mother had taught her, the same one she'd been making for our Thanksgiving table for over 2 decades. She'd gone still at the sink, and I knew she was listening. "My only option is to keep living here," I said. This house stays in the family, David. That's not negotiable. But even as I said it, I could see him doing math in his head, calculating. Now, 3 years after Caroline's funeral, I live here alone. My arthritis makes the stairs harder than they used to be, and my doctor says my blood pressure is too high for a man my age. 73 years old, taking 6 pills a day, and sometimes I catch myself talking to Caroline like she's still here. Did you remember to turn off the coffee pot? I'll call toward the kitchen. Or, Caroline, have you seen my reading glasses? The silence that comes back is getting heavier. David knows about the doctor visits, the medications, the way I sometimes forget things. Little things, where I put my car keys, whether I already fed the dog. We don't have a dog anymore. Rusty died 2 years ago, and I never got around to getting another one. David keeps track of these lapses like evidence in a case he's building. Dad, maybe it's time we talked about the future, he said last month when he drove up for one of his increasingly frequent visits. I mean, realistically, how long can you keep up this place by yourself? We were standing on the dock, looking out over the lake. October sunset, the kind that used to make Caroline sigh with contentment and slip her hand into mine. David had his hands in his pockets, shifting his weight like he was uncomfortable just being still. I'm managing fine, I told him. Are you, though? He turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression that reminded me uncomfortably of the way he used to look when he wanted something as a kid, patient but determined. I drove by last week and noticed the gutters need cleaning. The dock boards are starting to warp. The garage door is hanging crooked. Everything he said was true. Small maintenance issues that I used to handle without thinking, but that seemed overwhelming now. Caroline had always been the one to make the lists, to call contractors when needed, to keep track of what needed doing, when. I can hire people, I said. With what money, Dad? David's voice was gentle, but there was steel underneath. You're living on Social Security and whatever's left of Mom's life insurance. This place is bleeding money. That was the first time he'd brought up money directly, though I could see he'd been thinking about it for a while. The way he looked at the house now, I knew he was calculating mortgage values, property taxes, utility bills. In his mind, the lake house wasn't home anymore. It was a liability. But for me, it was everything. It was Caroline's laughter echoing off the water. It was David's first fish, a tiny sunfish that he insisted we mount on the wall like a trophy. It was 35 years of Christmas mornings and birthday parties and quiet evenings watching the sunset. It was the garage full of cars that held our history, and the workshop where I'd hoped to teach my grandchildren the same things I'd tried to teach David. This place isn't for sale, I told him that evening. Not now, not ever. He nodded, but I caught him taking pictures with his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. Pictures of the kitchen, the master bedroom, the view from the living room windows. Pictures you'd take if you were planning to list a property. That night, after David drove back to Minneapolis, I sat in the garage until almost midnight, not working on anything, just sitting in the old folding chair I keep next to the workbench, surrounded by the cars that had been my passion for decades. The '67 Mustang still needed work on the transmission. The Camaro had developed an oil leak that I kept meaning to fix. The pickup truck ran fine, but the paint was starting to fade and the upholstery needed attention. Projects I'd been looking forward to tackling when I retired. Projects I'd imagined sharing with David, maybe even with grandchildren someday. But David had never married, never showed much interest in settling down or starting a family. And lately, when he looked at the garage, I didn't see appreciation for the craftsmanship or the history. I saw him calculating square footage and wondering what the building might be worth as a separate lot. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos Caroline used to take. Pictures of me working on the cars, pictures of David helping me when he was younger, pictures of family gatherings in the driveway with all the cars displayed like some kind of vintage auto show. In one photo, David must have been about 16, standing next to the Mustang with a socket wrench in his hand and motor oil on his shirt. He was smiling, not the careful, measured smile he wore now, but a real smile, happy to be there, proud of whatever small repair we'd just completed together. When had that changed? When had my son stopped seeing these cars as treasures and started seeing them as junk taking up valuable space? I stayed up too late that night, reading through Caroline's old journals. She'd been a faithful record keeper, writing down everything from daily weather to family milestones to her private thoughts about our life together. In the weeks before she died, when the pain medication made it hard for her to hold a pen steady, I'd written down her words for her. "Robert," she dictated slowly, "I need you to promise me something. Promise me the lake house stays in the family. Promise me you won't let David pressure you into selling it before you're ready. This place, it's our legacy. It's the story of our life together." I'd promised her then, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of sleep. Of course I'd promised. Where else would I go? What else would I do? But now, sitting alone in the house that felt too big without Caroline's presence, I was starting to understand what she'd been worried about. David's visits were becoming more frequent, and our conversations increasingly focused on practical matters: my health, the property, my finances, the future, never the past, never memories, never the life Caroline and I had built here or the legacy we'd hoped to pass down. Just calculations. The phone rang at exactly 2 o'clock the following Sunday, just like always. "How are you holding up, Dad?" But this time, I heard something different in David's voice. Not just impatience, but urgency. Like a man who'd been making plans and was ready to set them in motion. "I'm fine, son," I said, looking out the window toward the garage where all our history sat, waiting for someone to care about it again. But I wasn't fine. And as I listened to David talk about weatherproofing and heating bills and the strain of maintaining all that property, I realized Caroline had been right to worry. My son wasn't calling to check on me anymore. He was calling to check on his inheritance. The signs started small, the way these things always do. David began showing up unannounced, which he'd never done before. Always with some excuse. He was in the neighborhood. Though my lake house is 45 minutes from anywhere David would have business. Or he'd just wanted to check on things after a storm we'd had. But his eyes told a different story. They'd sweep across the rooms like he was conducting an inventory. He'd run his fingers along windowsills, checking for dust. He'd test the kitchen faucet and frown at the drip I'd been meaning to fix. He'd stand in the living room, hands on his hips, staring at the water stain on the ceiling where the roof had leaked during last spring's heavy rains. "Dad, you really should get someone to look at that," he'd say, pointing up at the discolored plaster. "Water damage like that can spread, could affect the whole structural integrity of the house." Structural integrity. That was a new phrase in David's vocabulary, along with market conditions and property maintenance costs and estate planning. The first real warning bell came on a Tuesday in November. I was in the garage, trying to coax the Camaro's engine to turn over. It had been sitting too long, and the battery was weaker than it should be, when I heard David's voice coming from the house. He was talking to someone on his phone, his tone businesslike and confident. I walked back toward the house, not intending to eavesdrop, but curious who he was talking to in my kitchen at 10 in the morning on a weekday. David worked for a consulting firm in Minneapolis, supposedly had important meetings and client calls that kept him busy. What was he doing here during business hours? "No, I understand the timeline," he was saying as I approached the back door. "But we need to be prepared for when the situation changes. He's 73, taking multiple medications, clearly struggling to maintain the property." I froze with my hand on the door handle. "Right, exactly. Look, I'm not rushing anything, but we both know this can't go on indefinitely. The property alone is worth close to $800,000, maybe more with the right improvements. And the contents of the garage, well, some of those cars are worth serious money if they're restored properly." My chest tightened. The contents of the garage, like my father's tools and my grandfather's workbench and 30 years of automotive projects, were just line items in an auction catalog. No, he doesn't know I'm having this conversation," David continued, "and I'd prefer to keep it that way for now. But I need to know what our options are when the time comes." I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in a way that reminded me why my doctor kept adjusting my blood pressure medication. David was talking to someone about selling my house, my home, the place Caroline and I had sworn would stay in the family forever, and he was talking about it like it was already his. I stayed in the garage for the rest of David's visit, pretending to work on the Camaro while my mind raced. When I finally heard his car pull out of the driveway, I went inside and called the number on the business card Dr. Peterson had given me, a counselor who specialized in family transitions, which I was beginning to realize was code for what to do when your kids want to put you in a home. But I didn't call the counselor. Instead, I sat at Caroline's old desk in what used to be her craft room and pulled out the folder where we kept important papers. Insurance policies, the deed to the house, our wills. Our wills. Mine and Caroline's, drawn up 15 years ago by Tom Morrison, a lawyer who'd been our friend since college. Simple documents, really. Everything to each other. And when we were both gone, everything to David. It had seemed so straightforward then. David gets the house, the garage, the cars, the bank accounts, the life insurance policies, everything. At the time, it had felt like the natural thing to do. David was our only child, and despite Caroline's occasional concerns about his character, I'd convinced myself that blood was blood. Family was family, sons inherited from fathers. That's how it worked, how it had always worked. But looking at those documents now, I realized something that chilled me more than the November wind coming off the lake. David didn't need to wait for me to die to start making decisions about my property. If I became incapacitated, if my doctor declared me unable to manage my own affairs, if David could prove I wasn't competent to live independently. The phone conversation I'd overheard suddenly made more sense. David wasn't just planning for my death. He was planning for my decline. That evening, David called at his usual time, 2 o'clock on the dot. "How are you holding up, Dad?" "Fine," I said, though I was anything but fine. "How's work?" "Oh, same old thing. A lot of client calls, a lot of planning sessions. Actually, that reminds me, I've been thinking we should sit down soon and go over some practical stuff. Your finances, the house expenses, maybe look at getting you some help around the place." Help around the place. There it was again, wrapped in concern but sharp as a blade underneath. "I don't need help, David." I know. But Dad, be realistic. When's the last time you cleaned those gutters? When's the last time you had the furnace serviced? Mom used to take care of a lot of that stuff, and now... He let the sentence hang there, but I knew what he meant. Now, Caroline was gone, and I was just a sick old man rattling around in a house too big for him, surrounded by cars too expensive to maintain and memories too painful to face. Except, that wasn't true. Yes, I missed Caroline every day. Yes, some maintenance tasks that used to feel routine now seemed overwhelming. But I wasn't incompetent, and I wasn't ready to give up. "I had the furnace serviced last month," I said. "Peterson's Heating and Cooling, just like always. And I can hire someone to clean the gutters if they need it." Sure. But Dad, think about the big picture here. Property taxes on that place are what, $12,000 a year? Plus utilities, insurance, maintenance. You're probably spending $40,000, $50,000 a year just to live there. And for what? You barely use half the rooms anymore? Barely use half the rooms. As if the master bedroom where Caroline and I had slept for 32 years was just wasted space now that I slept there alone. As if the guest room where David used to stay when he visited was obsolete now that his visits had become business calls disguised as family time. It's my home, David. I understand that, Dad. I really do. But maybe it's time to think about what Mom would have wanted for you. She wouldn't want you struggling to keep up a place that's becoming a burden, would she? The manipulation was so smooth, I almost didn't catch it. Using Caroline's memory to justify something she would have hated. The idea of me being pushed out of our home before I was ready to leave. "Your mother wanted the house to stay in the family," I said firmly. "We talked about it many times. This place is our legacy, David." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when David spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, still patient, but with an edge of frustration. "Dad, I am the family. When you're gone, I'm all that's left, and I'm trying to look out for your best interests here. If you wait too long to make changes, if your health gets worse, if you have another episode like that dizzy spell you had last month." Another episode. I'd mentioned feeling lightheaded one afternoon, probably because I'd forgotten to eat lunch. David had turned it into a medical crisis, insisting I call Dr. Peterson, asking detailed questions about my medication dosages and whether I should still be driving. "I'm fine, David. My health is fine. For now, maybe, but, Dad, we need to be proactive here. We need to make plans while you're still able to make them yourself. While I'm still able." The implicit threat was so clear, I wondered if David even realized he'd made it. Get on board with his plans now, while I still had some say in the matter, or risk having the decisions made for me later. After we hung up, I walked down to the garage and sat in my usual spot beside the workbench. The space smelled like motor oil, and old wood, and the faint trace of Caroline's perfume that still seemed to linger, even though she hadn't been down here in years. I picked up one of my father's old wrenches, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship from the 1940s, heavy and perfectly balanced. My father had taught me to use tools like this one, and I'd tried to pass that knowledge on to David, but David had never been interested in working with his hands. He'd always preferred the clean, abstract world of numbers and strategies and deals. Now, he was treating our family's history like just another deal to be negotiated. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Dad, been thinking about our conversation. Maybe we should set up a meeting with Tom Morrison soon, just to review your estate planning documents. Make sure everything is up to date. Sound good?" Tom Morrison, our family lawyer, the man who'd drawn up the will that left everything to David, the man who'd known David since he was in diapers, who'd probably be sympathetic to David's concerns about his aging father's ability to manage his affairs. I stared at the text for a long time before responding. "We'll think about it." But I was already thinking about it. I was thinking about Caroline's warning, about the phone conversation I'd overheard, about the way David looked at our home like it was already his property. I was thinking about invisible contracts, the unspoken agreement that children will honor their parents' wishes, that family loyalty means more than financial opportunity, that love is stronger than greed. And I was beginning to realize that David and I had very different ideas about the terms of that contract. The next morning, I drove into town and stopped by the library. I needed to do some research, and I didn't want to use my home computer for this. David had helped me set up the internet connection last year, and I wasn't entirely sure he couldn't somehow monitor what I was looking at. I spent 3 hours reading about elder law, estate planning, and something called undue influence, the legal term for when family members pressure elderly relatives into making financial decisions that benefit the family member rather than the elderly person. What I learned made my blood run cold. David didn't need to prove I was incompetent to take control of my assets. If he could show that I was isolated, dependent on him for support, and making decisions that seemed irrational to outside observers, like insisting on staying in a house that was expensive to maintain, he might be able to argue that any changes I made to my will were the result of diminished capacity or outside manipulation. But the reverse was also true. If someone else was manipulating me, pressuring me to sell my house, to simplify my estate, to make decisions that primarily benefited them rather than me, that could also be considered undue influence. I drove home with my head spinning, but for the first time since Caroline's death, I felt like I had a clear understanding of the situation I was facing. My son wasn't just planning to inherit from me. He was planning to inherit from me as soon as possible, whether I was ready or not. And if I was going to protect what Caroline and I had built together, I was going to have to be a lot smarter than David thought I was capable of being. The invisible contract was about to become very visible indeed. The breaking point came on a cold December morning when I found David in my kitchen at 7:30 a.m., sitting at Caroline's table with a stack of papers spread out in front of him and Tom Morrison on speakerphone. I'd been in the garage since sunrise, couldn't sleep again, so I'd gone out to tinker with the Mustang's carburetor. When I came back for coffee, I heard voices through the kitchen window, familiar voices having an unfamiliar conversation about very familiar topics. Market analysis shows comparable properties selling between $750,000 and $900,000. Tom's voice crackled through David's phone, but that's assuming the house is in good condition. With the deferred maintenance issues David's described, we might need to adjust expectations downward. Deferred maintenance issues. I stood outside my own kitchen door, listening to my son catalog every minor repair I'd been putting off, as if they were evidence of my incompetence. "The roof leak in the living room is getting worse," David was saying, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "And the garage door barely opens anymore, plus there's that smell in the basement. I think the sump pump might be failing." There was no smell in the basement. The sump pump worked fine. But David was building a case, creating a narrative of an elderly man whose home was falling down around him because he was no longer capable of maintaining it properly. "Now, regarding the personal property," Tom continued, "David, you mentioned vintage automobiles. It's 5 cars total, a 67 Mustang, a 73 Camaro, a 55 Chevy pickup, and 2 others I can't remember the years on. Dad thinks they're worth a fortune, but honestly, they're all in pretty rough shape. Might be better to sell them to a collector who can restore them properly, rather than let them continue deteriorating. Let them continue deteriorating, as if 30 years of careful maintenance and gradual restoration work was just neglect. As if the cars I'd been lovingly working on since before David was born were junk that needed to be cleared out. The tools alone are probably worth $15,000-20,000, David added. Vintage craftsmen, some really old pieces that collectors go crazy for. But again, it's not like Dad's using them anymore. Not using them anymore. I looked down at my hands, still stained with motor oil from the 2 hours I'd just spent adjusting the Mustang's timing. My father's tools, my grandfather's workbench, generations of craftsmanship passed down from father to son, and David saw it all as merchandise to be liquidated. "What about resistance from Robert?" Tom asked. "Is he likely to fight any of these changes?" There was a pause, and when David spoke, his voice carried a tone I'd never heard before. Clinical, cold, like he was discussing a business problem rather than his father. "He's getting more stubborn as he gets older, more irrational. Last month he had what I think was a small stroke. Got dizzy, couldn't remember where he'd put his keys, seemed confused about what day it was. But he refuses to see a neurologist, refuses to consider that maybe he can't handle living alone anymore. I had not had a stroke. I'd been lightheaded because I'd forgotten to eat breakfast. And I'd misplaced my keys because I'd set them down in an unusual spot while bringing in groceries. But David was reframing normal senior moments as signs of cognitive decline. The other thing," David continued, lowering his voice, "is that he's become obsessed with Mom's memory. He talks to her like she's still there, asks her opinion on things, quotes conversations they supposedly had about keeping the house in the family. It's concerning. Concerning. My grief for Caroline, my habit of speaking to her photograph or asking what she would have thought about something, normal behaviors that most widowed people experience, were being pathologized as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. So, you think we need to move quickly," Tom said. "I think we need to be prepared to move quickly if his condition worsens. Right now, he's still legally competent, still able to make his own decisions. But Tom, I'm worried about what happens if he starts making irrational financial choices. What if he decides to give the house to some charity? What if he meets some woman and decides to remarry? What if he starts believing scam artists who target elderly people living alone?" Each hypothetical scenario David painted was more insulting than the last. In his mind, I wasn't a grieving widower trying to maintain his independence. I was a vulnerable target whose poor judgment posed a threat to David's inheritance. "Here's what I suggest," Tom said. "Let's draft some papers giving you power of attorney for financial matters, just as a precautionary measure. We can present it to Robert as a way to help him manage his affairs more efficiently. If he signs willingly, great. If not, we'll know we need to start documenting incidents that might support a competency hearing down the road." A competency hearing. They were discussing having me declared mentally incompetent, stripping away my legal right to make decisions about my own life and property. I stood in the December cold, listening to my son plan my legal death, and felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart. That had been breaking gradually for months. Something harder and more essential. My faith in family. My belief that blood meant something more than money. My trust in the boy I'd taught to drive stick shift in an empty parking lot 20 years ago. "I hate this," David was saying, and for a moment I thought he might be having second thoughts. "I hate that we're even having this conversation. But Dad's not the man he used to be, Tom. Mom's death hit him harder than anyone wants to admit, and he's just lost. Living in the past, surrounded by all that junk in the garage, talking to ghosts. That's what my conversations with Caroline had become in David's mind. Not the natural way a grieving spouse processes loss, but evidence of mental illness that needed to be managed by someone more rational, someone like him. The bottom line, David continued, is that I can't stand by and watch him destroy everything Mom and Dad built together just because he's too proud or too confused to accept help. This house, those cars, all of it, it's my family's legacy too. And if I have to take legal action to protect it, then that's what I'll do. My family's legacy, not our family's legacy. David was already thinking of himself as the rightful owner of everything Caroline and I had worked for, everything we'd built together. I wasn't the patriarch of the family anymore. I was just an obstacle to be managed until I could be removed. I walked quietly back to the garage and sat in the dark for 20 minutes, letting the cold seep through my jacket while I processed what I'd heard. When I finally returned to the house, David was alone in the kitchen, the papers neatly stacked, and Tom Morrison off the phone. "Morning, Dad," he said brightly, as if we'd just run into each other at the grocery store. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said, which was true. I'd been sleeping poorly for weeks, ever since David's visits had taken on their new urgency. "I brought some paperwork for you to look at," David said, gesturing to the stack on the table. "Just some estate planning stuff Tom Morrison suggested we update. Nothing major, just modernizing a few things to make sure you're protected." Protected. The same word he'd been using with Tom, but now it meant something entirely different. These papers weren't designed to protect me. They were designed to protect David's interests from me. "What kind of updates?" I asked, sitting down across from him. David slid a document across the table. "Power of Attorney for Financial Affairs," the header read. Below that, dense paragraphs of legal language that essentially gave David the right to make any financial decision on my behalf that he deemed in my best interests. "It's just a precaution," David explained, his tone patient and reasonable. "If you ever get sick, or if you're traveling and need someone to handle banking stuff, or if there's some kind of emergency where you can't make decisions yourself, it would give me the authority to step in and help without having to go through a lot of legal red tape." I read through the document carefully, my years of reviewing contracts at the insurance company coming back to me. The language was broad, deliberately broad. David wouldn't just be able to help with banking in an emergency. He'd be able to sell my house, liquidate my investments, make decisions about my medical care, essentially control every aspect of my financial life whenever he determined I was unable to do so myself. And who would determine when I was unable to make my own decisions? David would, with Tom Morrison's legal backing and whatever medical opinions David could gather to support his position. "This seems pretty comprehensive," I said carefully. "Maybe I should have my own lawyer look it over before I sign anything." Something flickered across David's face, surprise maybe, or irritation, that I wasn't simply accepting his explanation at face value. "Dad, Tom Morrison has been our family lawyer for 15 years. He drew up your original will, handled Mom's estate. You trust him, right?" "Of course I trust Tom, but this gives you a lot of authority over my affairs, David. I want to make sure I understand what I'm signing." "There's nothing to understand. It's completely standard. Every adult child should have power of attorney for their elderly parents. It's just common sense." Elderly parents. When had I become elderly in David's mind? When had I stopped being his father and become just another senior citizen who needed managing? "I'll think about it," I said, sliding the document back across the table. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dad, I'm not asking you to think about it. I'm asking you to sign it for your own protection." For my own protection. But I'd heard him talking to Tom Morrison, and I knew exactly who this document was designed to protect. I said I'll think about it. We stared at each other across Caroline's kitchen table, and I saw something in David's eyes that I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but a cold assessment. Like he was calculating odds, measuring resistance, deciding on his next move. Fine," he said finally. "Think about it. But, Dad, don't think too long. Things happen, health emergencies, financial crises. If something happens to you and we don't have the legal framework in place to help, it's going to make everything much more complicated." Much more complicated for whom? For me, lying in a hospital bed? Or for David, trying to take control of my assets without proper documentation? After David left, I sat in the kitchen reading the power of attorney document over and over again. The more I read, the clearer it became that this wasn't about protecting me from some hypothetical future emergency. This was about David protecting his inheritance from me, from the possibility that I might live too long, spend too much money on medical care, or make decisions about my property that didn't align with his financial interests. I thought about Caroline's words in those last weeks. "Promise me the lake house stays in the family. Promise me you won't let David pressure you into selling it before you're ready." She'd seen this coming. Somehow, Despite David's careful facade of filial concern, Caroline had understood that our son viewed our life's work not as a legacy to be cherished, but as an asset to be managed. And now, David was asking me to hand him the legal tools to manage me out of my own home. I walked down to the garage and sat among my father's tools, and my grandfather's workbench, and the cars that held 30 years of weekends and memories. This was what David wanted to liquidate. This was what he saw as junk taking up valuable space. But this was also where I was going to make my stand. If David wanted a legal battle over competency and control, then he was going to get one, but not the easy victory he was expecting. I was about to remind my son that the old man he was so eager to manage had been fighting battles and winning them since before David was born, and I still had a few moves he hadn't anticipated. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard David's voice on the phone with Tom Morrison, cataloging my supposed deficiencies like items on a medical chart, deferred maintenance, cognitive decline, talking to ghosts. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely and walked down to the garage. I turned on the old space heater Caroline had bought me years ago. She worried about me getting cold while I worked, and settled into the folding chair beside my workbench with a cup of coffee and one of Caroline's old journals. The garage felt different in the middle of the night, quieter, more intimate somehow. The cars sat in the shadows like sleeping animals, their chrome bumpers catching glints of light from the single bulb hanging over the workbench. This had always been my sanctuary, the place where I could think clearly and work with my hands and remember who I was before grief and old age started defining me. Caroline's journal was from 1998, the year David graduated high school. I'd grabbed it randomly from the box where she kept them all, but as I read her neat handwriting by the light of the work lamp, I realized it wasn't random at all. My subconscious had known exactly which year I needed to revisit. June 15th, 1998. David's graduation party today. Robert's so proud, talking about how David will probably take over the business someday, carry on the family traditions. But I watched David during the whole party, and he wasn't looking at the lake or the cars or anything Robert loves about this place. He was looking at the guests, calculating who might be useful contacts, networking even at his own graduation party. There's something cold about it that worries me. Caroline had seen it even then. The way David approached relationships like transactions, the way he evaluated everything in terms of potential benefit to himself. July 4th, 1998. David brought friends up for the holiday weekend. 3 boys from his business fraternity, all wearing identical polo shirts and talking about market opportunities and investment strategies. They spent the whole time analyzing property values around the lake, discussing which houses were underutilized and which owners were sitting on gold mines without realizing it. Robert showed them the garage, told them about his father's tools and the history of each car. They listened politely, but I could see they thought it was all junk. David didn't correct them. Even at 18, he'd been embarrassed by his father's passion for vintage cars and handcrafted tools. Even then, he'd seen our life's work as something to be apologized for rather than celebrated. August 20th, 1998. Big fight with David today about college expenses. He wants us to take out a second mortgage on the lake house to pay for his MBA program. Says it's an investment in the family's future, and that we'll get it all back when he starts making real money. Robert almost agreed to it. He wants to support David's education, but something about the way David presented it bothered me. Like he was already thinking of this house as his collateral to borrow against. Had to remind Robert that we promised each other never to put the lake house at risk. A second mortgage. At 18, David had already been trying to leverage our home for his own purposes. Caroline had stopped him then, but Caroline wasn't here anymore to spot the warning signs. I kept reading, following Caroline's growing unease about our son through the rest of that summer and into David's college years. Her entries painted a picture of a young man who was intelligent and ambitious, but fundamentally lacking in empathy. Someone who saw his parents not as people to be loved and respected, but as resources to be managed and eventually inherited from. December 23rd, 2001. David home for Christmas. Spent most of dinner talking about his internship at that consulting firm, how he's learning to optimize underperforming assets and maximize stakeholder value, Asked him what that meant in plain English, and he explained how they help families liquidate inherited property that's no longer generating appropriate returns. Robert didn't catch the implication, but I did. David is learning how to convince people like us to sell places like this. January 15th, 2003. David called today to tell us about his promotion. Making good money now, he says, and building wealth strategically. Asked when we might consider updating our estate planning documents. Said he'd been talking to some colleagues about tax optimization strategies and succession planning. He's 23 years old and already thinking about inheriting from us. It makes me sick. June 30th, 2005. Robert had his first heart episode today. Minor one, thank God, but it scared us both. David drove up immediately, but instead of focusing on Robert's health, he kept asking detailed questions about our insurance coverage, our medical directives, our will, offered to help coordinate our affairs while Robert recovers. I told him we were managing fine on our own. He looked disappointed. September 10th, 2008. David suggested we sell the Camaro today. Says classic car values are artificially inflated right now, and we should take advantage of market conditions. Told Robert it would be smart financial planning to liquidate some assets before the economy gets worse. Robert actually seemed to consider it until I reminded him that the Camaro was the first car we ever restored together. Some things aren't for sale, no matter what the market says. Page after page, year after year, Caroline had documented David's gradual transformation from son to heir apparent, his increasing focus on our financial situation, his subtle suggestions about asset management, his growing impatience with our attachment to things he saw as economically irrational. And through it all, Robert, me, missing the signs or choosing to ignore them because I wanted to believe my son loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with money. April 3rd, 2019. Doctor says the cancer is spreading faster than they hoped. Robert is trying to stay positive, but I can see how scared he is. David has been calling more often, asking about treatment costs, insurance coverage, long-term care planning. Yesterday, he suggested I might want to get my affairs in order while I'm still feeling well enough to make clear decisions. He's 39 years old and talking to his dying mother about getting her affairs in order. What kind of person does that? What kind of person indeed? I set down the journal and stared at the Camaro sitting 10 feet away from me. Caroline's favorite car, the one David had wanted us to sell for smart financial planning. The one he'd probably liquidate within a month of my death, along with everything else in this garage. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos David had taken during his last visit. He'd thought I wasn't watching, but I'd seen him documenting the house like a real estate appraiser. Kitchen, living room, master bedroom, view from the deck, photos that would be useful if you were planning to list a property. But there were no photos of the garage, no pictures of my father's tools or my grandfather's workbench, or the cars that represented 3 generations of automotive passion. In David's documentation of our family's assets, this space, the heart of everything I cared about, was invisible. Because to David, it wasn't an asset, it was an obstacle. I opened my laptop, the one David had given me last Christmas, saying I needed to stay connected and keep up with modern technology, and started researching elder law attorneys. Not Tom Morrison, who had been our family lawyer for 15 years, but was clearly more loyal to David than to me. Someone independent. Someone who specialized in protecting elderly people from exactly the kind of financial manipulation David was attempting. At 4:30 a.m., I found what I was looking for. Margaret Walsh, an attorney who specialized in elder rights and estate protection. Her website included articles about undue influence, financial abuse by family members, and something called predatory succession planning, the practice of pressuring elderly relatives into making premature financial decisions that primarily benefit their heirs. David wasn't just planning to inherit from me. He was actively working to accelerate the timeline, to gain control of my assets while I was still alive, but vulnerable enough to be manipulated. But there was something else I could do, something David hadn't anticipated because he'd underestimated his old man's capacity for strategic thinking. I could change my will. Not dramatically. That would raise questions about my mental competency and play right into David's narrative about my declining judgment. but I could make subtle modifications that would protect the things I cared most about while still ensuring David inherited the bulk of the estate. I could establish a trust for the lake house, with conditions that would prevent David from selling it immediately. I could specify that the garage and its contents were to be preserved for a certain period, maybe donated to a vintage car museum if David wasn't interested in maintaining them. I could build in safeguards that would honor Caroline's wish for the property to stay in the family while preventing David from treating it as liquid assets to be cashed out. Most importantly, I could do all of this legally and rationally with proper documentation and independent legal counsel, making it impossible for David to claim I was acting under diminished capacity. The irony was perfect. David's own pushiness, his obvious eagerness to gain control of my affairs, had given me the motivation and the justification to take steps that would limit his control permanently. By 6 a.m., I had a plan. Not revenge exactly, more like insurance. A way to ensure that Caroline's wishes would be honored and that the legacy we'd built together wouldn't be dismantled the moment I was no longer around to protect it. I made fresh coffee and sat in the garage watching the sunrise through the window. The cars looked different in the morning light, not like the junk David saw, but like the treasures they had always been. Pieces of automotive history, examples of American craftsmanship, tangible connections to the generations of men who'd worked in this space before me. David would never understand that. To him, sentiment was just an expensive luxury that prevented people from making rational financial decisions. But sentiment was exactly what I was fighting for, the right to be sentimental about my own life, my own property, my own legacy, the right to decide for myself when I was ready to let go of the things I'd spent decades building. David thought he was managing a confused old man who talked to ghosts and made irrational choices about asset management. He was about to discover that this confused old man still had a few moves left in him, and unlike David's legal maneuvering, my moves were going to be motivated by love rather than greed. By the time David arrived for his next check-in, I'd be ready for him. The power of attorney papers he wanted me to sign were still sitting on the kitchen table where he'd left them. I was going to sign them all right after I'd made some changes to my will that would make David's power of attorney a lot less valuable than he was expecting it to be. Caroline always said the best defense was a good offense. It was time to remind my son where he'd learned to be strategic in the first place. Part 3, The Counter Move. Chapter 5, Preparing the Chess Move. Margaret Walsh's office sat in a converted Victorian house in downtown Wayzata, 20 minutes from the lake. I'd called her at 8 a.m. sharp, explained that I needed to discuss protecting my estate from undue influence, and she'd agreed to see me that same afternoon. Her voice had been crisp, professional, with just enough warmth to suggest she understood the delicate nature of family financial disputes. I told David I was going to the doctor for a routine checkup. Not entirely a lie. I was going to get professional help for a serious problem. I just didn't mention that the professional was a lawyer instead of a physician. The waiting room felt more like someone's living room than a law office. Comfortable chairs, family photos on the mantel, a golden retriever sleeping by the fireplace. Margaret Walsh herself was probably 60, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She reminded me of Caroline in some ways, direct but kind, someone who could spot bullshit from across the room. "Mr. Henderson," she said, settling behind her desk with a yellow legal pad. "Tell me what's concerning you." I'd rehearsed this conversation during the drive over, but sitting there in her office, I found myself struggling to find the right words. How do you explain that your only child sees you as an obstacle to his inheritance? How do you admit that the boy you taught to ride a bike now views you as a liability to be managed? "My son wants me to sign papers giving him power of attorney over my finances," I began. "He says it's for my protection, but I think he's more interested in protecting his inheritance from me." Margaret nodded, making notes. "How old is your son?" 41, unmarried, no children, works for a consulting firm in Minneapolis. "And your current estate plan?" I explained the simple will Caroline and I had drawn up years ago. Everything to David when we were both gone. Clean, straightforward, exactly what most parents do for their only child. "But circumstances have changed since your wife's death," Margaret observed. "My relationship with David has changed," I corrected. "He's become calculating. Every conversation we have is really about money, property values, maintenance costs, my health, my ability to live independently. He's building a case that I'm no longer competent to manage my own affairs. I told her about the overheard phone conversation, the power of attorney documents, David's suggestions about selling the house and liquidating what he called my underperforming assets. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. Mr. Henderson, what you're describing is a textbook case of what we call anticipatory inheritance syndrome. Your son has mentally converted your assets to his assets and is now trying to manage what he sees as his property. Anticipatory inheritance syndrome. At least there was a name for it. The good news, Margaret continued, is that you're clearly competent to make your own financial decisions, and you're taking proactive steps to protect yourself. The bad news is that family financial disputes can get very ugly very quickly, especially when adult children feel entitled to their parents' wealth. I don't want to cut David out entirely, I said. He's still my son, but I want to make sure he can't just liquidate everything the moment I'm gone. My wife and I built something together, and I want it preserved. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying me. Tell me about what you built. So I told her about the lake house, about Caroline's garden, and the deck where we'd watched 35 years of sunsets. I told her about the garage, about my father's tools, and my grandfather's workbench, and the cars that represented 3 generations of automotive passion. I told her about Caroline's final wish, that the property stay in the family, that it not be sold off to strangers who would never understand its value. Your son sees these things differently? Margaret asked. He sees them as inventory, assets to be liquidated for maximum return. He's already talked to our family lawyer about market values and restoration costs and the most efficient way to dispose of what he calls the personal property. Margaret made more notes, then looked up at me with something that might have been admiration. Mr. Henderson, I've been practicing elder law for 20 years, and I've seen too many cases where parents realize too late that their children view them as obstacles rather than people. The fact that you're here now, while you're still fully competent and before any crisis has occurred, tells me you're thinking more clearly than your son gives you credit for. So what can I do? Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she enjoyed outmaneuvering greedy relatives almost as much as she enjoyed protecting vulnerable clients. We're going to give you some leverage, nothing dramatic, nothing that will trigger questions about your mental state. Just some strategic modifications to your estate plan that will ensure your wishes are honored, regardless of what your son thinks is best for you. Over the next hour, Margaret outlined a strategy that was both elegant and legally bulletproof. Instead of leaving everything directly to David, I would establish a revocable trust with specific conditions and protections built in. The lake house would go into the trust with a provision that it couldn't be sold for at least 10 years after my death. If David wanted to sell it after that, he'd need approval from an independent trustee, someone with no financial interest in the decision. The garage and its contents would be preserved for 5 years, giving David time to decide whether he wanted to maintain the collection or donate it to a vintage car museum. But he couldn't simply liquidate everything for quick cash. A portion of my liquid assets would go into a charitable trust-benefiting organizations that preserved automotive history. Not enough to impoverish David, but enough to ensure that some of our family's wealth would honor the craftsmanship and traditions he had no interest in maintaining. The beauty of this approach, Margaret explained, is that David still inherits substantially. He gets the house eventually, he gets most of your financial assets immediately, and he gets the cars if he wants to maintain them properly. But he can't treat your legacy like a fire sale. What about the power of attorney he wants me to sign? Margaret's expression hardened. We're going to make some modifications to that document as well. Standard power of attorney forms are often much broader than they need to be. We'll create a limited power of attorney that gives David authority to help with specific financial tasks, paying bills if you're hospitalized, dealing with insurance companies, that sort of thing. But he won't have blanket authority to make major decisions about your property without your explicit consent. Will that satisfy him? Probably not. But Mr. Henderson, your son's satisfaction isn't our goal here. Our goal is protecting your right to make your own decisions about your own property for as long as you're able to make them. I left Margaret's office with a stack of documents to review and an appointment scheduled for the following week to finalize everything. For the first time since Caroline's death, I felt like I had some control over my situation. David called that evening at his usual time. "How was the doctor visit?" he asked. "Fine, just routine tests. Blood pressure is stable, cholesterol levels are good. Dr. Peterson says I'm doing well for a man my age." "That's great, Dad. Really great. Hey, did you have a chance to look over those papers I left?" The power of attorney documents were still sitting on the kitchen table where David had left them. I'd read them several times now, and Margaret's analysis had been correct. They were much broader than necessary, giving David authority that went far beyond what any reasonable emergency would require. "I looked them over," I said, "but I think I'd like to have them reviewed by my own attorney before I sign anything." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, Tom Morrison is your attorney. He's been handling our family's legal work for 15 years. "Tom Morrison is our family's attorney," I corrected. "But this is my decision to make, and I want independent advice." I could hear David's frustration in the silence that followed. He'd expected me to sign the papers without question, the way I'd always deferred to his judgment on financial matters since Caroline's death. "Dad, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. These are standard documents. Every family should have them in place." "Then a week or two delay shouldn't matter, should it?" "I suppose not," David said, but his tone suggested he thought it mattered very much. "Just don't take too long, okay? Things happen, Dad. Emergencies come up. If something happens to you and we don't have the proper documentation in place..." "I understand your concerns, David, but I'm not planning on having any emergencies in the next few days." After we hung up, I sat in the garage with Margaret's documents spread out on my workbench. The trust agreement, the modified will, the limited power of attorney, dozens of pages of legal language that would fundamentally change the dynamic between David and me. For the first time since this whole situation began, I wouldn't be the vulnerable widower dependent on his son's goodwill. I'd be a man with a plan, with legal protections in place, with strategies that David didn't know about and couldn't manipulate. The irony wasn't lost on me. David had spent months positioning himself as the rational, forward-thinking son, helping his confused father navigate complex financial decisions. But I was about to demonstrate that the old man he was so eager to manage had learned a few things about strategic planning during his own decades in business. Caroline always said that the best negotiations were the ones where the other party didn't realize they were being negotiated with until the deal was already done. David was about to learn that lesson the hard way. I signed Margaret's documents that night, right there in the garage surrounded by the cars and tools that represented everything David wanted to liquidate. 3 generations of craftsmanship, 35 years of marriage, a lifetime of building something worth preserving. David could have his inheritance, but he was going to inherit it on my terms, not his. And his terms, I was beginning to realize, had never really included me at all. The changes started small, but I noticed them immediately. David's phone calls became more frequent, twice a week now instead of weekly. His visits stretched longer, and he began conducting what felt like inspections of the property. He'd walk through the house with his phone out, taking pictures of things that hadn't concerned him before. A loose floorboard in the hallway, a water stain on the basement wall, the way the kitchen faucet dripped if you didn't turn it off just right. "Dad, when did this start leaking?" he'd ask, pointing to some minor issue that had existed for years. "That's been like that since your mother was alive," I'd reply. But David would make a note on his phone anyway, building his case that the house was deteriorating, and I was no longer capable of maintaining it properly. The worst part was how he treated me during these visits. Not cruelly exactly, but with a kind of condescending patience that made me feel like a child who needed managing. He'd speak slowly, repeat himself unnecessarily, ask if I understood things that were perfectly clear. "Dad, did you remember to pay the electric bill this month?" "Of course I paid the electric bill, David. I've been paying bills for 50 years. I know. I'm just trying to help. Maybe we should set up automatic payments for some of these things. Make it easier for you." Make it easier for you, he meant. Automatic payments would give him a clearer picture of my financial situation, and eventually, when he had power of attorney, they'd make it easier for him to control my expenses. 3 weeks after my meeting with Margaret Walsh, David brought his girlfriend to dinner. Her name was Jessica, and she worked in real estate. a detail David mentioned several times during the evening, as if her professional expertise gave weight to whatever opinions she might form about my property. Jessica was polite enough, complimenting Caroline's china and asking appropriate questions about the history of the house. But I caught her taking pictures too, more subtly than David, but with the same appraising eye. A photo of the master bedroom with its outdated wallpaper, a shot of the living room that emphasized the water stain on the ceiling, a careful documentation of the kitchen, focusing on the appliances that were 15 years old and showing their age. "This is such a beautiful property," Jessica said over dessert. "The lake frontage alone must be worth a fortune. Have you ever had it appraised recently?" I hadn't, and I told her so. "You really should," she continued. "Property values in this area have skyrocketed in the last few years. I bet you'd be amazed at what this place is worth now." David nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what I've been telling Dad. The market is so hot right now, especially for waterfront properties. It might be the perfect time to consider some strategic moves. Strategic moves. More code language for selling my home while the market was favorable to David's financial interests. Of course," Jessica added, "maintenance is so important for preserving value. Deferred maintenance can really hurt you when it comes time to sell. Things like roof repairs, HVAC updates, that sort of thing. It can get expensive quickly, especially on an older property like this." They spent the rest of dinner talking about market conditions, renovation costs, and the challenges of maintaining legacy properties in today's economy. I sat at my own table, listening to my son and his girlfriend discuss my home like it was a business problem that needed solving. After they left, I called Margaret Walsh. "They're escalating," I told her. "David brought his girlfriend, and she's a real estate agent. They spent the evening documenting problems with the house and talking about market conditions. How did you respond?" "I didn't engage, just listened and let them think they were being subtle." Margaret chuckled. "Good. The more aggressive they become, the stronger our position gets if this ever goes to court. Are you ready to finalize the trust documents?" "More than ready." I met with Margaret the next morning to sign the final papers. The revocable trust was now officially established, with Margaret serving as successor trustee if I became incapacitated and an independent trust company taking over after my death. David would inherit everything eventually, but on terms that would preserve what Caroline and I had built together. The lake house couldn't be sold for 10 years. The garage and its contents had to be maintained for 5 years before David could make any decisions about disposal. A significant portion of my liquid assets would fund scholarships for vocational education. Young people learning trades like automotive restoration, woodworking, craftsmanship skills that David had never valued. "Your son is going to be very unhappy when he discovers these changes," Margaret warned me. "I'm not doing this to make David unhappy," I said. "I'm doing this to honor my wife's wishes and protect what we built together." But as I drove home, I had to admit that the prospect of David's reaction gave me a certain satisfaction. For months, he'd been maneuvering to gain control of my life and my property. He'd underestimated his old man's capacity for strategic thinking. He was about to discover that the confused widower he'd been so eager to manage still had a few moves left in him. That evening, David called with news. "Dad, I've been thinking about what Jessica said last night, about getting the property appraised. I called a guy I know, Randy Peterson. He's one of the best residential appraisers in the Twin Cities. He can come out next week and give us a professional assessment of the property value." Us. As if we were partners in this decision, rather than me being the sole owner of the property in question. "I don't need an appraisal, David. Dad, you need to know what you're sitting on here, and if we're going to make any major decisions about the property, we need current market data." Major decisions about the property. David was no longer pretending this was just about helping me manage maintenance issues. He was talking openly about making decisions that would obviously involve selling. "I'm not making any major decisions about the property," I said firmly. "Well, maybe not right now. But Dad, think about the future. What happens if you need long-term care? What happens if you have a medical emergency that requires expensive treatment? This house is your primary asset. You need to understand its value so you can plan accordingly. Long-term care, medical emergencies." David was painting scenarios where I'd be forced to liquidate my home to pay for my own survival. Scenarios where selling the lake house wouldn't be greed. It would be necessity. If you're worried about my medical expenses, David, I have excellent insurance, and I'm healthy for a man my age. For now, sure, but Dad, things change. People get sick, and when they do, decisions have to be made quickly. Wouldn't it be better to have all the information we need ahead of time? There it was again, the assumption that major decisions about my life and property would be made by committee, with David as the deciding vote. I'll think about it, I said, which was becoming my standard response to all of David's suggestions. Don't think too long, Dad. Randy's schedule fills up fast, especially this time of year. After we hung up, I sat in Caroline's old craft room, looking through the photo albums she'd so carefully maintained. Pictures of David as a baby, a toddler, a young boy learning to fish off our dock. Pictures of family vacations, Christmas mornings, birthday parties. 30 years of memories captured in Caroline's neat handwriting. David's first fish, Lake Minnetonka, July 1985. Teaching David to drive the boat, summer 1992. David's high school graduation, so proud, June 1998. When had that proud, happy boy turned into the calculating man who now saw me as an obstacle to his inheritance? When had family loyalty been replaced by financial opportunism? Or maybe the signs had always been there, and I'd just been too blind to see them. Maybe Caroline's concerns hadn't been unfounded suspicions, but accurate assessments of our son's character. Maybe the boy I'd taught to change oil and adjust carburetors had never really been interested in the work itself, just in the eventual ownership of everything the work represented. I closed the photo album and walked down to the garage. The trust documents were locked in a fireproof safe I'd bought years ago for important papers. David didn't know about the safe, hidden behind a false panel in my grandfather's old tool chest. Inside the safe, along with the trust papers, I'd placed a letter I'd written to David, an explanation of why I'd made the changes I'd made, what I hoped he'd understand about preserving legacy and honoring family history. A letter that might help him see that my decisions weren't about punishing him, but about protecting something larger than either of us. But as I sat in the garage surrounded by 3 generations of craftsmanship that David saw only as inventory to be liquidated, I wondered if that letter would ever matter to him. David had made his choice about what kind of son he wanted to be. Now it was time for him to live with the consequences of that choice. The appraisal was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I'd decided to allow it, partly because refusing would give David more ammunition for his incompetency case, and partly because I was curious to see how far this charade would go. But David didn't know that the property he was so eager to appraise was no longer entirely his to inherit. The reading of my will was going to be very interesting indeed. The heart attack came on a Tuesday morning in March while I was adjusting the timing on the Mustang. One moment I was leaning over the engine, wrench in hand, and the next I was on the garage floor with a crushing pain in my chest that felt like someone had parked a car on my ribs. I managed to call 911 before I lost consciousness. The paramedics found me 20 minutes later, still breathing, but barely. Dr. Peterson told me later that it was what they called a widowmaker, the kind of massive coronary that kills most men my age before they make it to the hospital. But I didn't die. Stubborn as Caroline always said I was, I hung on through emergency surgery, through 3 days in intensive care, through David's constant presence at my bedside, asking detailed questions about my medical directives and insurance coverage. "Dad, you gave us quite a scare," he said when I was finally alert enough for real conversation. "The doctors say you're going to be fine, but this is exactly the kind of emergency we talked about. Thank God we have those power of attorney papers ready to go." Except we didn't. The modified documents Margaret Walsh had prepared were still sitting in my kitchen, unsigned, while David waited for me to sign his original papers that would give him broad authority over my financial affairs. "About those papers," I said, my voice still hoarse from the breathing tube. "I need to make some changes." David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Dad, this isn't the time to worry about paperwork. You need to focus on getting better. I am getting better, and part of getting better is making sure my affairs are properly arranged." I spent the next week in the hospital, with David visiting every day, and growing more agitated as I continued to insist on reviewing the power of attorney documents with my own lawyer before signing anything. He brought Tom Morrison to my hospital room twice, both of them explaining patiently that emergency situations required prompt action, that legal complications could arise if we didn't have proper documentation in place. But I held firm. No signatures until I'd reviewed everything with independent counsel. Margaret Walsh came to see me on Thursday, bringing the modified documents and a portable notary. We conducted our business quietly during one of the few periods when David wasn't hovering nearby. I signed the limited power of attorney that would give David authority to help with specific tasks, but not blanket control over my finances. More importantly, I signed the updated will that established the trust and its conditions. Margaret witnessed the signature. The notary stamped the documents, and just like that, David's inheritance was no longer the simple liquid windfall he'd been counting on. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked me. "Once this is done, there's no going back without raising questions about your competency." "I'm sure," I said. "My wife asked me to protect our legacy. That's what I'm doing." I was released from the hospital the following Monday with strict instructions about medications, diet, and activity restrictions. David drove me home, talking the entire way about hiring home health aides, arranging meal delivery services, and making sure Dad has all the support he needs during recovery. All the support and all the oversight, he meant. The house felt different when I walked back in, smaller somehow, more fragile. David had been staying there while I was hospitalized, keeping an eye on things, and I could tell he'd been going through my papers. Nothing missing, nothing moved dramatically, but the subtle signs of someone conducting a careful search. He'd found the original power of attorney documents, still unsigned on the kitchen table, but he hadn't found the new ones, locked safely in the garage safe. "Dad, we really need to get this paperwork finished," David said that first evening. "This whole episode proves how quickly things can change. If something happens to you again, I need to be able to act on your behalf." "Something will happen to me again," I said. "I'm 73 years old, and I just had a major heart attack, but that doesn't mean I'm ready to hand over control of my life to anyone else." David's jaw tightened. "Dad, I'm not trying to control your life. I'm trying to protect your interests." "Whose definition of my interests? Yours or mine?" We stared at each other across the kitchen table, and I saw something in David's face that I'd never seen before. Not just frustration, but anger. Raw, undisguised anger at my refusal to cooperate with his plans. "Dad, you're being unreasonable. You're being selfish. Do you have any idea what the last week has been like for me? Sitting in that hospital, not knowing if you were going to make it, trying to figure out how to handle your affairs if the worst happened, and you won't even sign a simple legal document that would make things easier for both of us." Easier for both of us. But I'd heard David talking to Tom Morrison in the hospital corridor, discussing liquidation strategies and optimal timing for asset disposal. His definition of easier involved converting my life's work into cash as quickly as possible. "I'll sign appropriate documents," I said, "but I want them reviewed by my own attorney first." "Tom Morrison is your attorney. Tom Morrison is our family's attorney, but this is my decision to make." David slammed his hand on the table, rattling Caroline's china in the cabinet. "Jesus Christ, Dad, what do you think I'm trying to do here? Steal from you? Cheat you? I'm your son." "Yes," I said quietly. "You're my son. And that's exactly why this is so painful." David left that night without another word, and I didn't hear from him for 3 days. When he finally called, his tone was different, colder, more businesslike. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation the other night. Maybe you're right about getting independent legal advice. Why don't you call whoever you want to review those documents and we'll move forward from there?" I should have been relieved, but David's sudden reasonableness worried me more than his anger had. He was planning something, developing a new strategy now. That direct confrontation had failed. I called Margaret Walsh and explained the situation. "He's probably going to argue that your recent medical crisis affected your judgment," she said. "People sometimes become paranoid or suspicious after major health events. He might use your refusal to sign his documents as evidence that you're no longer thinking clearly. So what do? You stay consistent, you take care of your health, and you let me worry about the legal strategy." But I was worried too. David had been patient for months, building his case gradually, waiting for the right moment to act. My heart attack had provided that moment, a medical crisis that justified his concerns about my independence, a legitimate reason for family members to step in and make decisions on my behalf. The question was, what would David do when he discovered that his inheritance wasn't the straightforward windfall he'd been expecting? I didn't have to wait long to find out. Margaret Walsh called me on a Thursday morning in late April, 6 weeks after my heart attack. "Robert, we need to talk. I just received a petition from Tom Morrison's office. David is asking the court to appoint him as your guardian and conservator." Guardian and conservator. Legal terms that meant David was trying to have me declared incompetent, unable to make my own decisions about my property or my personal care. On what grounds? Recent major medical event affecting cognitive function, paranoid behavior regarding family members, refusal to accept appropriate assistance with financial management, making irrational decisions about asset preservation. Each accusation was technically accurate, but completely misleading. Yes, I'd had a heart attack. Yes, I'd become suspicious of David's motives. Yes, I'd refused to sign his power of attorney documents. But none of that meant I was incompetent. "How strong is his case?" I asked. "Weak if we fight it properly." "But Robert, this is going to get ugly. David is essentially arguing that his own father has lost the capacity to manage his own affairs. That's not something you come back from easily." "Can he win?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Guardianship proceedings favor family members, especially adult children, who can demonstrate a pattern of concerning behavior by the elderly person. David has been documenting incidents for months. Your health issues, your reluctance to accept help, your attachment to property that requires expensive maintenance. A sympathetic judge might see a devoted son trying to protect his confused father. And if he wins, he gets everything he wanted without having to wait for you to die. Complete control over your finances, your property, your medical care. He could sell the house, liquidate the cars, put you in a facility, whatever he thinks is in your best interests. I sat in the garage that afternoon, surrounded by the cars and tools that represented 3 generations of craftsmanship, and realized that David had outmaneuvered me. While I'd been focused on protecting my legacy through careful estate planning, he'd been building a case to take control of my life immediately. The trust I'd established, the conditions I'd built into my will, none of it would matter if David succeeded in having me declared incompetent. A guardian could challenge any legal documents I'd signed, arguing that they were the product of diminished capacity. But there was one thing David didn't know, one card I still had to play. The letter I'd written to him, explaining my decisions, was still locked in the safe. But I was going to give it to him now, before the guardianship hearing, along with copies of the trust documents and the modified will. Not because I thought it would change his mind. I'd given up hope of that months ago. But because I wanted him to understand exactly what he was destroying in his rush to claim his inheritance. David was going to get his legal victory. The judge would probably grant the guardianship petition, and my son would gain control of everything I'd worked for. But he was going to have to live with the knowledge that he'd stolen it from his own father. And when the reading of my actual will eventually came, because even David couldn't keep me alive forever, he was going to discover that his victory was more hollow than he'd ever imagined. The last card was still mine to play. I just had to stay alive long enough to play it.